The night was calm, the streets quiet, and the air thick with the weight of something unseen. She had been driving home after a long day, the city lights reflecting in her rearview mirror as she navigated familiar roads. The hum of her engine was steady, her hands relaxed on the wheel. There was no reason to be tense until the sudden flash of red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. She sighed, her fingers instinctively tightening around the wheel as she slowed down. She had done nothing wrong. Her speed was within the limit, her taillights were working, and her registration was up to date. Yet, as the sirens wailed behind her, she knew what was coming. It wasn't the first time she had been pulled over for no apparent reason. She signaled, pulled to the side of the road, and took a deep breath. The officers took their time approaching the car, as if savoring the moment. When the first officer reached her window, his flashlight beamed straight into her eyes, an intimidation tactic she had seen before. She didn't flinch. "License and registration," the officer barked, his voice devoid of courtesy. She complied without a word, reaching into her glove compartment and handing over the documents. The officer barely glanced at them before exchanging a knowing look with his partner. The second officer, a taller man with a smug expression, circled around to the passenger side, his eyes scanning the interior as if expecting to find something incriminating. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer ordered. She raised an eyebrow. "Is there a reason for this stop, officer?" Her tone was measured, calm. She knew her rights. "Step out now." His tone hardened. No explanation, no justification. She exhaled slowly and complied, stepping out into the cool night air. The first officer yanked her wrist, spinning her around roughly. "Hands on the hood," he demanded. She clenched her jaw, but didn't resist. She could have easily flipped the officer onto his back in seconds, but she wasn't here to reveal her skills, at least not yet. As she pressed her hands against the car's hood, she felt them moving behind her, whispering low enough to avoid the dashcam's audio range. She could hear the telltale rustling of plastic, the soft sound of something being tucked away. And then, well, the taller officer said mockingly, stepping beside her with a smirk. In his gloved hand, he held a small bag of white powder. "What do we have here?" She turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "That's not mine," she said, her voice firm but devoid of panic. "Sure it isn't." The first officer laughed. "Looks like we just got ourselves another drug bust." The taller one pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, we have a suspect in possession of a controlled substance, requesting backup." Her mind raced, not with fear, but with strategy. She knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about law enforcement. This was a setup, a manufactured arrest. They had picked her because they assumed she was powerless, another black woman who wouldn't stand a chance against their word. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She kept her breathing steady, her eyes scanning her surroundings. The dash cam was still recording, and she knew how to access footage. The officers' careless overconfidence was their biggest mistake. They thought they had control of the situation, but they had no idea that their target was a CIA agent with the power to dismantle their entire careers. Instead of pleading or arguing, she let them have their moment. Let them think they had won. Let them pile on the corruption. The deeper they dug their own graves, the more satisfying it would be when the truth exploded. Because soon it would. She stood still, her hands pressed against the hood of her car, her heartbeat steady. Years of training had conditioned her to remain calm in high-pressure situations. She had faced far worse than this. Undercover missions, hostage negotiations, life-or-death scenarios where a single misstep meant disaster. This was nothing more than a waiting game. The officers thought they had her figured out. To them, she was just another target, another easy arrest they could manipulate to boost their numbers. They didn't see the intelligence behind her eyes or the quiet power in her stance. They didn't notice how she subtly shifted her weight to keep herself ready for anything. They had no idea that she was memorizing every detail, the badge numbers, the scratches on their name tags, the faint scent of stale coffee on the officer behind her, the way the taller one kept tapping his fingers against his belt in a nervous rhythm. She listened carefully, catching their hushed conversation behind her. "Make sure the cam doesn't catch it." "Already disabled the mic. Should be good." "Backup's on the way. Let's get her in cuffs before they get here." They were sloppy, overconfident. They thought their power was absolute, that their word alone would be enough to convict her. They didn't realize she was 3 steps ahead. The first officer grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. "You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance." His voice dripped with fake authority, as if he enjoyed saying those words. She let out a quiet breath and turned her head slightly. "Do you really think this is going to stick?" Her voice was controlled, almost amused. The officer stiffened, surprised by her lack of fear. "Doesn't matter what you think," he shot back. "We have evidence." She allowed herself a small smile. "You think you do." The taller officer stepped closer, his presence meant to intimidate. "You really don't get it, do you? You're done. That little attitude of yours isn't going to help when you're sitting in a cell." She tilted her head slightly, looking at him with an unreadable expression. "And you don't get it either," she said, her voice unwavering. "You just made the worst mistake of your career." For the first time, doubt flickered in the officer's eyes. It was barely there, a fraction of a second, but she caught it. He didn't like how calm she was. He expected fear, begging, anger, not this eerie composure. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence. Backup was on the way. She let them cuff her, making no effort to resist. She wasn't here to fight, not yet. She was here to observe, to let them think they had won. Because the moment they walked into that courtroom, everything would change. She felt the cold steel of the handcuffs tighten around her wrists as they pushed her toward the squad car. She didn't flinch. Instead, she looked straight ahead, her mind already working through her next steps. She knew exactly how this would play out. They would take her to the station. They would book her, take her fingerprints, try to process her like any other suspect. They would smirk, thinking they had another win. And then, the moment they ran her name through the system, everything would collapse around them. The realization would hit like a freight train. The whispers, the rushed conversations between officers, the way their faces would pale as they realized they hadn't just arrested a random woman, they had arrested a CIA agent. And by then, it would be too late. The courtroom was packed. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a dull glow over the wooden benches filled with spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers who had caught wind of the case. The officers walked in with an air of confidence, their uniforms pressed, their expressions smug. To them, this was just another day in court, another case they had wrapped up neatly. They were certain the judge would take one look at the evidence and hand down a swift, guilty verdict. After all, who would believe her over them? She sat at the defense table, calm as ever, her hands folded neatly in front of her. There was no nervous tapping, no darting eyes, no signs of distress. While others might have crumbled under the pressure, she sat with an air of quiet authority. It wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. The prosecutor stood, clearing his throat before addressing the court. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case. The defendant was found in possession of illegal substances during a routine traffic stop. The arresting officers followed proper procedure, and the evidence clearly supports the charges against her." He turned to the officers. "Officer Reynolds, please state for the court what happened on the night of the arrest." The first officer, Reynolds, took the stand, adjusting his uniform before speaking. "On the night in question, the suspect was pulled over for a minor traffic violation. During the stop, we noticed suspicious behavior, which led us to conduct a search. Upon searching the vehicle, we discovered a bag containing a controlled substance in the center console." His testimony was smooth, practiced. He had done this before. The prosecutor nodded. "And is this the bag in question?" A small, clear plastic bag was held up for the court to see, the supposed evidence. Reynolds nodded. "Yes, sir, that's what we found in her vehicle." The prosecutor turned toward her, his expression expectant. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" She slowly stood, adjusting her blazer before speaking. "Yes, I do." Her voice carried through the courtroom with undeniable confidence. "But first, I'd like to ask Officer Reynolds a few questions." The judge nodded, granting permission. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she approached the witness stand. "Officer Reynolds, when you pulled me over, what was the stated reason for the stop?" Reynolds hesitated, just for a second. "A broken taillight," he said. She arched an eyebrow. "Interesting. Because my car was impounded after the arrest, and upon inspection, both taillights were fully operational. Would you like to explain that? Reynolds shifted in his seat. It must have been a mistake on my part. Right. A mistake. Her expression didn't change. And when you searched my vehicle, did you have probable cause? He straightened. The suspect was acting suspiciously. She tilted her head. Suspiciously? Can you define that? She seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact. The audience murmured. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. She smiled, but there was no humor in it. So in your experience, nervousness is enough to justify a search without consent. Reynolds clenched his jaw. Given the circumstances, yes. She took a slow breath. And you're absolutely certain that this bag, she gestured to the evidence, was found in my car? Reynolds nodded. Yes. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to present some new information. The courtroom fell silent. She pulled a document from her folder and handed it to the bailiff. This is a forensic analysis of the plastic bag in question. Not only do my fingerprints not appear anywhere on it, but the only fingerprints present belong to Officer Reynolds himself. The judge's eyebrows lifted. Reynolds' face paled. She wasn't finished. Additionally, I have security footage from a nearby traffic camera that shows Officer Reynolds removing the bag from his pocket and placing it inside my vehicle while his partner distracted me. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. And finally, she said, stepping closer, her voice like steel, before we continue, I should probably introduce myself properly. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet. She flipped it open, revealing the unmistakable emblem of the Central Intelligence Agency. Reynolds looked like he might be sick. The courtroom erupted. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the weight of the revelation pressing down on everyone present. The officers who once stood confidently were now visibly shaken. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable as he carefully studied the CIA badge she held up. Even the prosecutor looked stunned, shuffling through his notes as if searching for something, anything, that could salvage the case. She lowered her badge and slid it back into her pocket, allowing the silence to stretch for just a moment longer. She wanted them to feel it, the impending doom creeping up their spines, the realization that they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. The judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Miss, or should I say agent? She met his gaze. Agent. A slow exhale left his lips, his fingers drumming lightly against the bench. Agent, can you confirm your current position with the Central Intelligence Agency? I'm a field operative specializing in intelligence analysis and covert investigations. Her voice was steady, unwavering. I've spent years working undercover to dismantle corruption, both domestically and abroad, and tonight it seems corruption found me instead. The room erupted into another wave of murmurs. The officers squirmed in their seats. Their carefully constructed lies were collapsing, and the weight of their actions was becoming undeniable. The judge turned his gaze toward the prosecutor. Do you have any prior knowledge of the defendant's identity? The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. No, Your Honor. She was processed as a civilian. Had I known her credentials, I would have reviewed the case more thoroughly before bringing it to trial. A slow, knowing smile crossed her lips. Well, now you know. She turned her attention back to Reynolds, who had yet to say a word since her revelation. His breathing had become shallow, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. She took a step closer to the stand, her voice calm but laced with a sharp edge. Tell me, Officer Reynolds, would you like to change your statement? His lips parted, but no words came out. His partner, seated beside him, shifted uncomfortably. He looked as if he wanted to disappear, but there was nowhere to run. I'd advise you to choose your next words carefully, she continued, because perjury carries serious consequences. But then again, so does framing an innocent person. I'd say you're already in enough trouble. Reynolds swallowed hard, his hands clenched and unclenched on the wooden stand. I didn't. Didn't what? She cut in sharply. Didn't expect me to fight back? Didn't expect me to have evidence? Didn't expect me to be someone who could actually take you down? The tension in the courtroom thickened. The judge leaned back in his chair, plus watching everything unfold. He wasn't going to interfere. He wanted to see where this was going. She turned to the bailiff. I request that Officer Reynolds and his partner be taken into custody immediately. The bailiff hesitated, glancing at the judge. The judge nodded once. Proceed. There was a stunned silence before the courtroom exploded again. Gasps, shocked murmurs, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as two more officers entered to escort Reynolds and his partner away. The taller officer, the one who had smirked at her during the arrest, stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. You can't do this. She didn't even flinch. Actually, I can. And I just did. Reynolds tried to argue, but his words were lost in the noise. The reality of their downfall had set in, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The very system they had abused was now turning against them. As the officers were led away in handcuffs, the same ones they had placed on her not too long ago, she finally allowed herself to take a deep breath. Justice had been served, and it wasn't over yet. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, with the fabricated evidence exposed, I request that all charges against me be formally dropped. The judge gave a firm nod. Charges against Agent. He paused, realizing he hadn't yet said her name. Agent Monroe are hereby dismissed. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck, and just like that, the case was over. But the fallout, that was just beginning. The aftermath of the courtroom's chaos spilled into the hallways. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones extended, their voices overlapping in a desperate attempt to get a statement. Agent Monroe, did you expect this outcome? Were you aware the officers had planted evidence on you? What happens now for the officers involved? She didn't slow her stride. With her chin held high, she moved through the throng with precision, her training allowing her to remain unbothered by the growing storm of questions. She had no obligation to explain herself to the press. The truth had already been revealed where it mattered most, in court. As she stepped outside the courthouse, the cold night air hit her, crisp and refreshing. Freedom always had a different scent when you'd been forced to fight for it. She pulled out her phone, dialing a number she knew by heart. It's done, she said as soon as the line connected. A deep voice responded on the other end, calm and collected. I saw the footage. You handled it well. She exhaled. They weren't even careful about it. Their arrogance was their downfall. That's how it always is, the voice replied. They assume they'll never be caught, but they forgot who they were dealing with. A small smirk played on her lips. They won't forget now. They won't have the chance to. There was a pause before the voice continued. The department's already launched an internal investigation. Those two officers aren't the only ones under scrutiny. That made her pause. You mean the corruption runs deeper than just them? Her fingers tightened around the phone. She had suspected as much. Crooked cops rarely acted alone. They were part of a system that protected them, emboldened them, convinced them they were untouchable. And for a long time, they had been. She nodded to herself. I want in on the investigation. A chuckle came from the other end. I figured you would. She glanced back at the courthouse where reporters were still lingering, waiting for a statement. Send me everything you have. Already on your desk. The call ended. She slid her phone back into her pocket and took a deep breath. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Exposing two corrupt officers was just the beginning. If there was more rot within the system, she was going to dig it out, piece by piece. As she walked toward her car, her mind was already working. Every step she had taken up until now had led her here. Every mission, every case, every risk she had ever taken had been preparation for this moment. She wasn't just an agent. She wasn't just another woman they had tried to silence. She was a reckoning, and she wasn't done yet.